Let's bring in right now the founding editor in chief of Just Security. He's also a professor of law at New York University School of Law, Ryan Goodman. He's out with a new piece entitled "Why the White House May Not Dare Fight on Executive Privilege." This is a fascinating article, Ryan. And from your take on it, if the president did invoke that authority, he could be setting up a defeat that might haunt him for the rest of his years in the White House.
That's exactly right. And my co-author is Andrew Weissmann, former general counsel of the FBI. The basic argument is if the president actually knows a lot about executive privilege, he should know that invoking it could really boomerang in the way in which there's an exception to executive privilege, which is if, in fact, the information, it provides evidence of a crime. And does the president of the United States really want a federal court opining as to whether or not the allegations with respect to Ukraine involve criminal activity? And that could obviously impact the impeachment. If he's acquitted by that time, then still it could impact his political prospects. It could also impact, as we write, the Southern District of New York that might be looking at Mayor Giuliani. And if a federal court says, well, this actually is about criminal activity, it would only bolster the prosecutors there to look at co-conspirators.
So talk about that phrase, if it could involve a crime. How much latitude does the court have in making that decision? Or does a court, when given that standard, do they look at it and just say if there is any possibility at all of criminal activity based on the facts before us, then we cannot rule that there's going to be this executive privilege invoked?
So it's not a criminal trial. It's just about seeking information. So the standard is much lower than beyond a reasonable doubt. It's preponderance of the evidence. So let's say 51%. And, you know, Paul Manafort can tell you all about this because it actually happened to him in the very same court where he tried to invoke attorney-client privilege. The court, the judge said to him, "You sure you want to do that? Because if you invoke it, then I have to make a determination as to whether or not your communications might involve criminal activity." Then she issues this gigantic opinion detailing all of the criminal activity that she's reached by a preponderance of the evidence. That's not what he wanted.
Heidi's with us and has a question.
Yeah, great article. And I think you may be right that the Republican strategy, if it does come to witnesses, may just be to try and discredit John Bolton, pull him in a closed-door deposition, and then just give different accounts of what he said. But John Bolton is known to have taken copious notes and documented a lot of what happened during his time there. We know he has a book coming out. So what if he shows up with receipts? What if he shows up with evidence that what he says is true? Can they exert executive privilege over that and just require that only his oral testimony stands?
So they could try to exert executive privilege over both. It would be very hard for them to do it for one and not the other. One of the other exceptions to executive privilege is if the information is already in the public domain. So once he testifies about the very communications, interactions, verbally, it's done, and therefore there would be no way to really block the notes. So much so there would be just like a very quick decision by any court. That's also the part of our argument that they would never want to really go to court in the first place. So this isn't about like some elongated court battle and litigation. It's really deterring the White House from ever seeking this path.
So, Ryan, you say in your piece that the conversation on the telephone on July 25th between the President of the United States and President Zelensky is not covered by national security privilege. Donald Trump is trying to make the case that it is. Why do you say he's wrong?
So he's wrong on a couple levels. First, there's this thing called waiver. So once they've released the transcript and then talked about it, that's already kind of game over for the conversation.
Yeah.
And then on the other one is that Congress is acting at the zenith of its power in impeachment. And what folks who prefer executive privilege like to say is, oh, George Washington said in our communications with foreign leaders, there's executive privilege. But what they leave out is George Washington said, except for an impeachment, that's when you have to give that information over. So there are multiple ways in which it's just not going to really lift off.
So, Ryan, if John Bolton were indeed called to testify, the thought is that the White House would then try to invoke executive privilege. But the president he's already spoken publicly about John Bolton. Doesn't that waive privilege potentially?
So that's another way in which he could have waived executive privilege. And there are some former federal prosecutors who think that his three-part tweet thread repudiating John Bolton is actually a form of waiver, because he's saying, no, John Bolton says X, I'm saying Y. But then by him saying Y, it actually allows for John Bolton to also speak as well. I wouldn't put as much emphasis just in that tweet thread. To whatever degree the president has been talking about these sets of facts, that's waived. Executive privilege. You can't say only I can talk about it in the public domain and others can't. Once it's in the public square, then executive privilege is basically over.
You wonder what his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who's usually a stickler for the law, is thinking about the president possibly waiving his privilege. Professor of Law at New York University School of Law, Ryan Goodman, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate you being here. And still ahead, the Trump administration's Middle East peace plan appears to be a non-starter for the Palestinians. NBC's Andrea Mitchell joins us with her latest reporting on those developments, coming up next on Morning Joe. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.